We've come to the general conclusion concerning Syriac Bibles that by anywhere from 125 to 150 A.D., there was an existence of following: a Syriac translation of the Old Testament done by non-Christian Jews. By the period from 125 to 150, these things would have been in existence. A Syriac Old Testament done by Christian Jews and revised according to the LXX. And thirdly, portions of the New Testament, probably by Palestinian Jewish Christians who were resident in Syria. An Old Testament done by the Jews, an Old Testament done by the saved Jews, and portions of the New Testament done by resident Syrians, but from a Palestinian background because of a Palestinian flavor that we see in them. Now in the New Testament, the portions probably would have been of the various Gospels. We would have maybe a Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John together, or those separate, or those harmonized in some way, and this would be probably the first segment of the New Testament that would have been translated. Now, one question that arises very early, and there's been some discussion over this, whether or not the earliest Syriac New Testament translations were of gospel harmonies or of the four as individuals. Tatian's Diatessaron is the most ancient and most significant of old-time early church history biblical gospel harmonies. We know that exists, but we think that exists after the time of which we're speaking now. So there's been a lot of discussion concerning the gospel translations from Greek into Syriac. Were they harmonies, or were they of the individual authors? I'll explain more what I mean by a harmony later on. It's hard to say, to be definite on that, whether or not the earliest one was in the form of a harmony, or the earliest one was in the form of four individual Gospels. I would say that they both existed very, very early. It's just when we ask the question, which came before which, that would be impossible to say. What about the rest of the New Testament? Well, we don't have any manuscripts extant that contain anything from Acts to the book of Revelation, but we do see quotations of various other New Testament books in the writings of the Syrian churchmen. And because we see quotations dating from the 3rd century onwardly from other books of the New Testament besides the so-called four Gospels or the four evangelists, that would tend to prove that Acts and the epistles and the book of Revelation would probably have existed sometime in the 2nd century A.D. as a translation into the Syriac language, but definitely not one of the earliest things. The Gospels would have come first. Now, what we're going to come to this evening concerns evidence for the old Syriac Gospels. What evidence do we really have that they ever existed? Not all of what we're saying is speculation, only a small essence, only the hypothesis, the arrangement of the material is more or less speculation as to what took place and when this occurred. We haven't really dealt in too much detail with concrete evidence, and by evidence I mean in manuscript form, for the existence of an Old Testament translated by the Jews into Syriac, and an Old Testament translated by Christian Jews into Syriac, somewhere in the end of the 1st or the beginning of up to the middle of the 2nd century A.D. But I have given you quotations from other writers of the 2nd century who are quoting from something done in Syriac, and it has to do with the Old Testament. That would tend to be our only real good concrete proof that we have. In other words, manuscripts of the Syriac, of the old Syriac Old Testament translations from the 1st and the 2nd century simply are not extant. It's another question, however, when we come to the subject of a translation of the New Testament, particularly the old Syriac Gospels. Remember that we're only looking from this time forward at translations of the New Testament. Eventually, the language and the people that are resident there will translate the Old Testament into whatever language into which they're translating the New Testament as well. So we're not too concerned with that. What evidence do we have for the real existence of old Syriac Gospels? Well, we have two lines of concrete manuscript evidence that are extant. First of all, let's deal with the Curtonian Syriac manuscript. Curtonian. The Curtonian Syriac manuscript. And I'll have to give you a little of the history of each one of these as we go along. There's the Curtonian Syriac and there's the Sinaitic Syriac manuscripts that are the only extant concrete manuscript evidences that we have for the translation of the so-called Old Syriac Gospels. Let's start with the Curtonian Syriac. A man by the name of Henry Tatum. I mentioned him last time, Tattam. Henry Tatum, who was a Coptic scholar. Coptic is one of the Egyptian dialects. We'll discuss Coptic translations, Sahidic and Coptic later. They come under Egyptian translations. Who lived from 1789 until 1868. Was a man who did extensive travels in the first half of the 19th century in search of the discovery of manuscripts. A lot of this not concerning this man in particular, but concerning the adventurous era into which this man was born, the same era as Tischendorf and some of the other men. We've already discussed a lot before of the adventurous spirit so many of these men had. It was an unparalleled time in manuscript history for the discovery of ancient manuscripts. They just seem to be turning up everywhere. We've gone through the so-called Age of Enlightenment. We've gone through the so-called Renaissance period. Man is supposed to be a, quote, thinking man, unquote, by now. And to be a thinking man, you have to be a searching man. And these men have searched the monasteries, the caves, and everything, trying to uncover manuscripts. He was on a trip in 1842 in Egypt when he came upon various Coptic and Syriac works in a monastery known as the Monastery of myriad de Para, Mary, the Mother of God. In the Monastery of Mary, the Mother of God, in the Nitrian Desert, which is just west of Cairo, Egypt. I won't take the time to draw all of that up here, but you probably know where Cairo is. Just west of Cairo, what's called the Nitrian Desert, Nitrian. And upon arriving here at the Monastery of Myriad de Para, he came across all types of Coptic and Syriac ancient manuscripts that were kept there, that had been kept there evidently for centuries upon centuries. These were brought back to the British Museum. He was working for the British Museum at this time. They were brought back in the same year, 1842, where the assistant keeper of the Department of Manuscripts, whose name was William Curtin, hence the name, the Curtonian Syriac manuscript, who was a Syriac scholar, born in 1808 and died in 1864, went over the Syriac manuscripts which he had retrieved. Tatum was a Coptic scholar. Tatum was the one who had to do with the Coptic manuscripts. William Curtin, Cureton, was a Syriac scholar, the assistant keeper of the Department of Manuscripts. So, of course, it was to him these manuscripts were brought. He was born in 1808, to give you the dates again, and he died in 1864. He went over the Syriac manuscripts. Now, this takes a period of time. You'll find that whenever someone has gone out, and the same thing is true today, but whenever someone was sent out from a museum or from a library or from a university or college or whatever, well, they might bring back a lot of manuscripts, and you'd turn it over to whoever was the curator of the archives or the keeper of the Department of Manuscripts or whatever, and there would be a period of sorting through them, having to untie some of them or unbind some of them to get them apart, to be able to read them, and sorting through them, labeling them, cataloging them, comparing and contrasting them, and so it took a little time. He began rummaging through these works brought back to Tatum, and in 1847, 5 years later, he discovered several important items that have been extremely important to us since that time. The last of these will be what we discuss, but I'll mention the first two nevertheless. 3 important items. First of all, he discovered 3 of the epistles of Ignatius that were written in the Syriac language. Ignatius, remember, we said last time, was the bishop. He called himself the bishop of Syria, or the bishop of Antioch. 3 of the epistles of Ignatius in Syriac, 1 to Polycarp, 1 to Ephesus, and 1 to Rome, to which he was going, of course. 1 to Polycarp, 1 to Ephesus, and 1 to Rome. Something else that he found the festal letters, F-E-S-T-A-L. I think we discussed the festal letters back on the Easter or the Christmas tape, somewhere back there. The festal letters of Athanasius, also, of course, in Syriac. F-E-S-T-A-L, the festal letters of Athanasius in Syriac. And then thirdly, and for our point of view most importantly, he discovered a peculiar patchwork codex dating from 4th to 5th century, whose oldest part was 80 leaves of a previously unknown Syriac version of the Gospels, in the order of Matthew, Mark, John, and Luke. Now, it was a peculiar patchwork codex because of the fact that it had pieces of manuscripts that came from every conceivable chronological era. We're way back to the 4th and 5th century A.D. This was the oldest part. 80 leaves comprised the oldest part of the codex that he was rummaging through. Then you'd have other leaves that obviously dealt with other periods of chronology all the way up until fairly recent times. And it all somehow, somewhere along the line, began to be bound together, or was all bound together at one time, but it'd have to be a recent time in order to be bound together with the recent manuscripts there. He published this manuscript in 1858. And I want to give you what it contained. It contained the following. In the order, as I said, of Matthew, Mark, John, and Luke. A codex dating from the 4th to the 5th century. That is the oldest part of it, 80 leaves. It had Matthew 1:1 through 8:22, 10:32 through 23:25a. It had Mark chapter 16, verses 17b through 20, which makes it a little unique, since that last section in Mark is such a disputed section anyway. Contained John 1, verse 1 through 42a, 3:5b through 7:37a. Still in John, chapter 14. This gets a little picky here in this chapter, but chapter 14, 10b through 12a, 15b through 19a, 21b through 24a, and 26b through 29a. No wonder I call it patchwork. Then over in Luke, Luke is the last of the Gospels. See, our order of them is not inspired. They've been seen many, many different ways. Just happens to be the English way that they've ended up in, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In Luke, we've got Luke 2, verse 48b through 3:16a. Then we've got 7:33b through 15:21. And finally, we have 17:24 through chapter 24, verse 44a. Oh, it may sound like a boring life to live, to be the assistant keeper of the Department of Manuscripts. And I guess it would be. I would tend to agree, it would be. But at least somebody does this for us, so that it's all been done. And then they write books about it, and then we don't have to sit in mothballs in a library somewhere trying to go over the material. Now, shortly after this, 3 stray leaves were found attached to another manuscript in the Royal Library of Berlin that have been proven to be part of this same 4th to 5th century manuscript of the 80 leaves. So shortly after this publication in 1858, 3 stray leaves, that gives us 83 total then, were found attached to another manuscript in the Royal Library of Berlin that contained parts of this Syriac, Old Syriac Gospel. And it had John 7:37b through 8:19. Then it had Luke 15:22 through 16:12. And then it had Luke 17, verses 1 through 23. Now the manuscript, the oldest part of this manuscript that was found, that has since become known as the Curtonian Old Syriac manuscript. The manuscript dates from the 4th to the 5th century A.D., but the text in the manuscript goes back to the 2nd century A.D. See, we can tell that a text, goes back, or in other words, we can tell this is not the autograph, this is not the original of whatever the scribe, this is a copy of the copy. Up until this discovery, it was widely held by most scholars that the Peshitta was the oldest Syriac translation that one could have. I think I mentioned that last time. Up until last century, it was generally felt that the Peshitta was the oldest Syriac translation that one could find. Only a few scholars, one of those being Griesbach, only a few scholars dissented at this point. Of course, they have since been proven to be right. The type of text that it has probably would be best characterized as Western. It is of a Western text type. Now, do you see what I'm saying here then? That means this translation, although the manuscript, the oldest part of this whole patchwork codex that was found, this manuscript only dates back to the 4th to the 5th century A.D. The text, it's a Syriac translation of Matthew, Mark, John, and Luke. The text goes back to as early as the 2nd century A.D. What that obviously proves would be the Jews didn't do this. The Jews never would have, that is, unsaved Jews, non-Christian Jews, never would have translated any part of the Gospels, any part of the New Testament for that matter. It can only prove that Christian Jews were living somewhere in eastern Syria, because in western Syria, the capital being Antioch, they spoke Greek. It was a Greek Hellenistic cosmopolitan city, one of the 3 largest in the Roman Empire of this time. Christian Jews in the eastern part of the province of Syria had to have translated this sometime in the 2nd century. By some other proofs, we can know that we can move it back to probably the first half of the 2nd century, but that'd be getting a little ahead of our story now. Although I've already said that before, somewhere from 125 to 150, we know that these things are accomplished. An Old Testament done by the Jews in Syriac, an Old Testament done by the Christian Jews in Syriac, and portions of the New Testament, particularly the Gospels, done in Old Syriac. And then later, the whole New Testament would have followed. So there is one concrete piece of evidence that we have as far as the manuscripts are concerned, that there really did exist at one time. There really was a beginning to the Syriac, the Old Syriac Gospels. And then a second line of evidence is referred to as the Sinaitic Syriac manuscript. And it's even a little more important than the Curtonian Syriac. The Sinaitic comes from Sinai, the Sinaitic Syriac. Here's how the story runs concerning this manuscript. In 1892, two Scottish twin sisters, I even have their names, Mrs. Agnes S. Lewis. If you ever meet them, you'll want to say something to them. And Mrs. Margaret D. Gibson. I could even give you the middle name. I'll just give you the initials. Mrs. Agnes S. Lewis and Mrs. Margaret D. Gibson, two Scottish twin sisters, were poking around St. Catherine's Monastery on Mount Sinai. Remember, this is where earlier Tischendorf had discovered the famous Sinaiticus manuscript. No doubt, probably you could still discover something at St. Catherine's Monastery. But they were poking around St. Catherine's Monastery, 1892, and discovered a 4th to 5th century palimpsest, Syriac palimpsest. Now, what's a palimpsest? It's been erased and it's been written over. An epistograph is written on both sides. A palimpsest is a manuscript that's been erased. We call it erased. Sometimes what they did was scrape off the lettering. But we would say erase because we're used to pencils with erasers on the end of them. Erased, scraped off, and written over. Of course, the problem with scraping off is you can't get everything off. The problem with erasing some things is you can only erase so much, which means that it can be seen through the new text that's been superimposed upon the manuscript. It contains Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in that order, but it's longer than the Curtonian. So I won't give you all of the references like I did with the Curtonian that it contains because it's longer than the Curtonian. We know from its history that it was erased at a convent near Antioch in the year 778 A.D., with a non-canonical work being then written in, superimposed upon the now faint Old Syriac text. Now, naturally, that made it extremely difficult to decipher. And down to this day, it has remained impossible to be certain of everything. But by means of chemicals and photography, the vast majority of it has been read. The Sinaitic Syriac. It's a 4th to 5th century palimpsest, but the text, just like with Curtonian, dates back to the 2nd century A.D. And generally it's felt to be slightly older than the Curtonian. And it's even possible, hypothetically, for the latter to be more or less a revision of the former. That is, for the Curtonian to be in some manner based upon the Sinaitic manuscript. That can't be proven, but some people have suggested that, and there are certain lines of evidence that would appear to point in that direction. Now, the Curtonian and the Sinaitic manuscripts are the only two manuscript representatives of the Old Syriac translations which are extant. Of any Old Syriac translation, whether of the Old Testament by unbelieving Jews, the Old Testament by believing Jews, the Gospels, a harmony of the Gospels, Book of Acts, Epistles, Apocalypse, any portion of the Bible in the Old Syriac language, in Old Syriac. The only two manuscript representatives that we have. The Syriac study is, we could almost say in its infancy, with the discovery of these manuscripts. Interest has heightened and developed. We've had more discoveries as late as 1957 of important works in Syriac. So I can report there's still great hope that more will someday soon be discovered that will shed more light on this question of Syriac translations. There certainly seems to be the possibility of more existing out there and of more being discovered in the future. It's just that the whole study of Syriac translations is a relatively new, infant-type study. So we'll have to wait and see what the future holds. Now, there is a particular question we need to raise and answer here. Well, probably several of them. One of them goes right in line with what I've just been saying there. We're saying that these are the only two manuscript representatives of the old Syriac translations. We'd ask then, why don't we have more representatives of the old Syriac text? If it really ever did exist. I mean, we've got 5,000 Greek manuscripts, 5,000 of them, 5,000 Greek manuscripts that date back as early, plus later, but as early as these old Syriac translations here. That is, the text, of course, these manuscripts are from the 4th and 5th century. We've got many things of the Greek New Testament that antedate that by quite a bit. Why no more representatives? Probably because they were destroyed as new manuscripts were made. And I do have one little proof, one little bit of evidence for that. I'll give that to you probably in a future message, probably in the next message in this class. But they probably were destroyed as new manuscripts were made. You remember this was done, for instance, by the Jews. Whenever a manuscript wore out in the synagogue, the best thing to do was put it in a geniza, put it in the storeroom, and then eventually all the manuscripts would be burned or be buried. And of course, the famous Geniza Cairo discovery that was made in the last decade of last century was a tremendous discovery. They had put all these manuscripts in this storeroom to be stored for a period of time until they were burnt or buried. And then the next architect who came along built a wall up over the entrance, the door, into the Geniza there. And as a result, it was sealed off and had been sealed off for centuries and centuries, and the manuscripts were all in there, thankfully neither burned nor buried. Maybe something like this still exists for Syriac studies. We really don't know. It seems to be that we're going to have some more who, in some method or some fashion were able to escape destruction. It brings us to the question of harmonies of the Gospels. It seems like the old Syriac translations may have been work done by private individuals, because it's not until a little bit after this time that we have anything that even assumes to be something that has an official character. It really doesn't end up official, it just ends up popular, I guess I should say. And officially, it's stamped out later on. What that is, we'll get to here in a moment. It doesn't seem like, well, with the cases I've just given you, with the Curtonian and with the Sinaitic manuscripts, we definitely don't have what we call gospel harmonies on our hands, such as Tatian's Diatessaron. As a matter of fact, it seems like harmonies must have existed at that time, because these manuscripts, both the Curtonian and the Sinaitic, actually have either a heading or a colophon, an ending, that actually set them over and against a gospel harmony, as though we're saying this is not a gospel harmony and other gospel harmonies do exist out there. Here's what I mean by that. For instance, at the beginning of the Curtonian, we have this little heading: Matthew, Mark, John, and Luke. We have this little heading, the gospel, and I'm translating this into English now, the gospel of the separated one, comma, Matthew. The gospel of the separated one, Matthew. The Sinaitic manuscript has a colophon, an ending, which reads as follows: here ends the gospel of the separated ones, comma, 4 books. Of course, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, the word that I'm translating, separated one, was in Syriac a technical word for a technical designation, as opposed to a gospel harmony, like the Diatessaron of Tatian. The gospel of the separated one, Matthew, for Curtonian. Here ends the gospel the separated ones, comma, 4 books. That was at the end, so it had to include not just John, the last of those 4 Gospels in the Sinaitic manuscript, but all 4 of the books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And I'm saying that the word I'm translating, separated one, or separated ones, was a word used as a technical designation, and it was used in opposition to a harmony, like the diatessaron of Tatian. Therefore, here's our conclusion from this little bit of history and this little bit of manuscript evidence. See, we have this right in these 2 manuscripts here. That seems to prove that as early as the Old Syriac Gospels, from 125 to 150 A.D., as early as the Old Syriac Gospels, we also have Old Syriac Gospel harmonies. Sadly, none of which are extant. Now, the diatessaron is extant, but that comes a score of years later. But that must mean, since a designation is being used here to set these 2 manuscripts in opposition to something that's not a separated one. In other words, if it's not a separated one, it means that it's a joined one. It means that the 4 Gospels must in some sense be all joined together, which today we call a synopsis in a technical term, or we call a gospel harmony, a harmony of the Gospels. So they must have existed at that time. That's why I started off this message saying earlier, they did exist. Singular Gospels existed, Matthew by itself, Mark by itself, John by itself, Luke, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John by themselves. They did exist that way. Both of them are existing together. Which one came first? It's impossible to say. We don't know how far this tendency to try to harmonize or to collate the Gospels, we don't know how far that goes back. It's been practiced popularly down through history up until the 20th century. We don't know how far it goes back. I guess I would say, maybe in my estimation, it seems as though since the Gospels were initially written in an individual fashion, Matthew wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, then probably, this would just be my supposition, probably whenever they were translated into Old Syriac, they were translated as individual Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But at a very short period or time after that, they were moved from there right on into some harmonies. Now, this brings us to the diatessaron of Tatian. I think I'm just going to introduce Tatian this evening, the man Tatian, T-A-T-I-A-N, and we'll probably spend either 1 or 2 messages on Tatian's diatessaron. This is back on the bottom of page 8 of your outline. You might want to turn there. We skipped this. You won't remember what was really going on there, but I can kind of fill this in for you. Why we skipped this way back whenever we were looking at witnesses to the New Testament text. The bottom of page 8. You see number 5, the diatessaron of Tatian. What we were looking at there under number 3 were witnesses to the New Testament text. We looked at some different papyri, John Ryland's, the Bodmer collection, and see we discussed each one of those. The Oxyrhynchus sayings of Jesus. We looked at some New Testament things that were applicable to what we were studying then. Some of the Chester, and it was Greek, not Syriac then. Some of the Chester Beatty papyri, and then number 5, the diatessaron of Tatian, date, contents, history, and importance. Now the reason I had that there, that's a perfect place to put that. You could put it either place, or as we're trying to do, both places, but only discuss it in either or of the places. The reason I had that there was because this is a late 2nd century witness to the New Testament text. And one thing it seems to prove is that the critics are wrong in their habitual extreme late dates for the 4 Gospels, because we have records of the diatessaron of Tatian that date from the latter half of the 2nd century A.D. How could the Gospels be written, let's say, in 190 A.D.? Luke wrote his Gospel in 190 A.D., 190 years after the birth of Christ. How could that have taken place whenever there already were translations of Luke 20 years prior to that? Then Luke had to have been in existence then. So the diatessaron has really been a thorn in the side of critical scholarship. We'll cover that history a little bit more later. As a matter of fact, critical scholarship has just adamantly, for many years, denied the historicity of the diatessaron notation. But what always happens is when you try to deny things, when you really shouldn't be denying things, trying to prove things that shouldn't be proven because Luke was not written in the 2nd century, but rather the 1st century A.D., then what happens is two Scottish twin sisters look around in some monasteries and prove you to be wrong because they come up with some archaeological ancient manuscript discoveries. Not that they were the ones who discovered the diatessaron notation, they certainly weren't, but I'm just saying people do make discoveries and it just throws out of sync completely these critical notions about the non-historicity of the diatessaron notation. So there's where it was included on your outline. Now if you'll jump up to where we are, we're on page 12, the bottom of page 12. Translations of the Holy Scriptures, Roman numeral 8. Large letter A, ancient translations. Number 2, Old Testament. B, language groups. 3, group 3, Syriac. You have underneath that Old Syriac. And then we're going to squeeze in between Old Syriac and the Peshitta, the diatessaron notation. I'd already listed it earlier, that's why it's not listed again here. But we're squeezing in between Old Syriac, chronologically, and the Peshitta, the diatessaron notation. Now here's the first problem we're going to deal with, then we're going to move beyond Old Syriac. We're going to be through with Old Syriac Gospels here in a moment. But we do have one problem. The diatessaron seems to date from around 170 A.D. The problem that we have is that there seems to be the help of the diatessaron in the two manuscripts we've just discussed, Curtonian and Sinaitic. How can that be since they came earlier is the problem. In other words, we could see how they have bled over into the diatessaron since it chronologically follows by at least 20 years and by perhaps more than that the Curtonian 2nd century text, not the 4th to 5th century manuscript, and the Sinaitic, not the 4th to 5th century palimpsest, but the text upon which it's based, back to the 2nd century, back to the first half of the 2nd century. So whenever something is coming later, how can that which came earlier show evidences of that which came later? That's the problem here. The best solution seems to be to answer this with the phrase, because of the extreme popularity of the diatessaron. It took over all Syriac groups, Syrian people, for several centuries as being an extremely, extremely popular translation of the Gospels into Syriac. Old Syriac would have come first, but the Old Syriac tradition later was probably influenced by the diatessaron, even though the Old Syriac manuscripts came first. So we're still dealing with copies of copies, and we'd have to be dealing with copies of copies, or there could be no influence bleeding over from the diatessaron to the Curtonian or to the Sinaitic. Now that's one option we can have of explaining this problem. How is it we can see signs of the diatessaron in Old Syriac Gospels which allegedly came earlier than did the diatessaron? That's one way to explain it. Say that it came in the year 1, the Old Syriac Gospels came in the year 1, and the year 5 the diatessaron came, and so in the year 7, whenever we're to a translation of a translation of a translation, a copy of the original Old Syriac Gospels, now because the diatessaron has such widespread popularity, you can't help but even in your mind, because whoever's doing the copying now has the diatessaron, has its phrases and so forth in one's mind, you can't help but maybe slip some of those into the manuscripts. That doesn't prove that the original text that one now is copying, it doesn't prove that it does not go back earlier than the diatessaron. It just proves that it's been influenced. There is another suggestion. It was held by Theodor Zahn, the famous German theologian, New Testament scholar, I guess I should say, and Nessel, Zahn and Nessel, Z-A-H-N, and Nessel. Both felt that the diatessaron came first, came earlier. than Old Syriac Gospels, thus proposing no problem for us then, that the Old Syriac Gospels show signs of similarity from the Diatessaron. And Black is another scholar who changed his position, however, and now he sides with Theodore Zahn, Matthew Black. So you've got two options of trying to explain how the Old Syriac Gospels end up seemingly under the influence of the Diatessaron. That's one suggestion, and I've given you my suggestion, the first of those. It seems like chronologically the Old Syriac Gospels came first, and then copies of them were later influenced due to the widespread popularity of the Diatessaron. So we're saying probably both the Old Syriac Gospels and the Diatessaron were initially independent of one another. They probably began initially independent of one another. The Diatessaron, just because it comes after the Old Syriac Gospels, was not based upon them. And the only real bleeding over that we see would be from the Old Syriac Gospels to Tatian's Diatessaron. Okay, do you have any questions on that? We've got a few more things I'm going to say about Tatian. Introduce Tatian. I won't say anything about his Diatessaron beyond what I've already said. We'll start into that next time. Okay, this brings us into our next Syriac translation. We've done Old Syriac of the Old Testament by Jews and by Christian Jews. We've done Old Syriac of the New Testament Gospels, probably all made by the year 150, probably other portions of the New Testament also made by this time, seen in the quotations from the Syrian churchmen, the church fathers, but not seen in any extant manuscripts. This brings us chronologically in order to our next Syriac translation. So we go through Old Syriac up to the Diatessaron, up to the Peshitta, and up to some later translations. It's referred to always as the Diatessaron of Tatian. Who was Tatian? We'll have to discuss him for a few moments. Who was Tatian? He was an Assyrian Christian. No one knows where he was born, where in Assyria. Assyria doesn't exist anymore, but the region that at one time was known as Assyria. Through a lot of word study and word play, Theodore Zahn, Z-A-H-N, a New Testament scholar I mentioned a moment ago, came to the conclusion that he probably was born in either Edessa or in Adiabene in Arbela. Probably right, because those were the two chief centers of study and of civilization in eastern Syria. So he's referred to always as an Assyrian Christian. This is part, of course, of ancient Assyria. Probably born either in Edessa or Adiabene in Arbela, the capital of Adiabene, between the upper and lower, the greater and lesser Zab rivers, in the year 110 A.D. As a young man, he just became enamored over Greek rhetoric and philosophy and spent all of his early years wandering all over that part of the world, learning, studying, reading, writing. Of the writings of his that we have, or allusions to them, or quotations from them, he quotes approximately 100 different classical authors. That's how well read he was. To be able to quote 100 different authors then is to be fairly well read. There were books around, libraries around, but certainly not like what we have today. He finally ended up in Rome. He's going to have to end up in Rome. Rome's the capital city of that part of the world of that day. He probably ended up there approximately 150 A.D. He wandered through the cities debating, practicing his rhetoric, learning a little of not only the Greco world, but the Greco-Roman world. Now Rome has conquered Greece. Learning about Roman philosophy, Roman theology, the Roman deities and so forth. And all of this is sketchy, but it's fairly reliable here. Evidently he met and came under the influence of Justin Martyr. Justin Martyr was the 2nd century's most famous apologist in the Christian church. Somewhere we discuss that, maybe in Acts or something, the difference between an apologist and a polemicist. But he was the 2nd century's and one of the church's all-time greatest apologists. He was located in Rome around 150, Justin Martyr. Of course, he died shortly after this time. And it's fairly certain that Tatian came under the influence of Justin Martyr. He may have even become a pupil or a disciple of his. It didn't seem, however, to last very long. He soon began to pull away, showing strains of independent, and we might add unorthodox thinking that has come across in his writings that are extant, as well as allusions made to him by other church writers. It's been said by some writers that if Tatian had anything good about him, he picked it up from Justin Martyr. Justin Martyr was a meek, humble, kind, brilliant. He was brilliant, but he was a meek, humble, kind man. And orthodox, basically orthodox in his theology. On the other hand, Tatian was not very orthodox. Well, we should say he certainly didn't end up very orthodox. If he got anything good, he probably picked it up from Justin Martyr. His problems began whenever he began to show these strains of independent thinking and began to pull away from Justin Martyr, his instruction. And of course, Justin Martyr died shortly after this period of time. That left Tatian on his own. That caused him to return to his homeland somewhere around 170 to 172 A.D. He returns to Syria, maybe to Edessa, Adiabene, Arbela, some part of Syria, ancient Assyria, around 170 to 172. And probably ends up dying there as well, probably in this year 172. Therefore, we date him around 110 to 172. During his lifetime, according to Jerome, he wrote innumerable books, but we only know a few of them by name. I'll mention 4. Jerome says he wrote innumerable books during his lifetime. We know of 4 by name. First of all, he wrote a book entitled On Animals, which does not survive, but we know its theme. That being man without the image of God is no better than a beast, was the essence of his work entitled On Animals. A second work of his was known as On Perfection According to the Savior. On Perfection According to the Savior. Here he stressed the fact that Paul, in his estimation, in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, that Paul laid down the celibate rule for all Christians to follow. In other words, that celibacy was not an option, but it was a commandment by the Apostle Paul. I would that all men were even as I. 1 Corinthians 7, KJV language. That Paul laid down as a rule the celibate life for all Christians. A third book, and this is his most famous outside of the Diatessaron, that we know of anyway, was entitled Oration Against the Greeks. Oration Against the Greeks. Now this is extant. I have a copy of it here. What this is about, he's very bitter, through bitter mockery and contempt. He just maligns the Greco-Roman world and thought, of which he himself, of course, had earlier been a part. He had been enamored over Greek rhetoric and Roman thought and philosophy and so forth. And it seems to show up here in this particular book, Oration Against the Greeks, how he had a falling out with Justin Martyr. Justin Martyr was a very able writer as far as an apologist was concerned. He was a very able writer, but he knew how to He knew how to write with grace and with tact. He knew how to get across his point, but he knew how to write with grace and with tact. Tatian certainly didn't know how to write that way. He lacked the tenderness, he lacked the tact, he lacked the grace that Justin had. It's just a bitter, sarcastic, contemptuous mockery of Greek philosophy. And of course, whenever you have been caught up in that all of your life in the past, you should be able to appreciate the values and the extents of Greek thought at this time. I mean, Paul says that it's all foolishness in 1 Corinthians 1. But there are other places. I mean, even in taking the time and going to the trouble to set Greek philosophy and Jewish speculation over against the gospel shows we must be talking about two significant thought patterns. The pattern of Jewish thought, they're always wanting to see the miraculous, and the pattern of Greek thought, they're always enamored with the mind, with the incredible abilities of the mind. And one should be able to see this coming through in the work of someone like Tatian, who had been a disciple of Greek thought and philosophy and rhetoric for so long, but such is not the case here. He actually tells us here in this book, we have a little section that's autobiographical concerning his conversion experience, which I will read here in a moment. And in essence, he tells us that what converted him to Christianity was the fact of the simplicity of the Bible. In light of that, he said, all this grandeur of Greek civilization and thought, he said, I hold all of this in utter disregard and contempt. Now here in Oration Against the Greeks, chapter 29, it's got 40, 50 chapters in it. 40 or 50 chapters in it, and it's biting. It's extremely biting. He calls all the Greeks demons and all their deities demons, and the latter of those statements would certainly be true. He says here in chapter 29, wherefore, having seen these things, I've traveled the world, I'm a traveled man, and I'm a well-read man, the two things that are supposed to put you ahead in life. Wherefore, having seen these things, and moreover also having been admitted to the mysteries, and having everywhere examined the religious rites performed by the effeminate and the pathetic, and having found among the Romans their Jupiter delighting in human gore and the blood of slaughtered men, and Artemis not far from the great city sanctioning acts of the same kind, and one demon here and another there instigating to the perpetration of evil, retiring by myself, I sought how I might be able to discover the truth. He said all this is vain and worthless here. And while I was giving my most earnest attention to the matter, I happened to meet with certain barbaric writings. Now, what he means there is the Bible. He found the Bible. But he said, in your estimation, you Greeks out there, this is barbarism here, these Jews and these Christian people. So he's writing with biting irony and satire here. Retiring by myself, I sought how I might be able to discover the truth. And while I was giving my most earnest attention to the matter, I happened to meet with certain barbaric writings too old to be compared with the opinions of the Greeks. The Greeks like to think we're an ancient civilization here. But he says, wait a minute, I'm reading books that go back to Abraham, 2,000 years BC now. So the wisdom of these books, that would far surpass the wisdom of the Greeks. And too divine to be compared with their errors. And I was led to put faith in these by the unpretending cast of the language. No bombastic tone in the Bible, and that's certainly true. The inartificial character of the writers. They're not artificial. The foreknowledge displayed of future events, the excellent quality of the precepts, and the declaration of the government of the universe as centered in one divine being. See, the Greeks, they got too many beings, to handle. You don't know who's God today, or yesterday, or who will be tomorrow. My soul being taught of God, I discern that the former class of writings lead to condemnation, but that these put an end to the slavery that is in the world, and rescue us from a multiplicity of rulers and 10,000 tyrants, while they give us not indeed what we had not before received, but what we had received, but were prevented by error from retaining. And then he goes on, the next one is entitled, How He Resolved to Resist the Devil. The philosophy of the Christians more ancient than the Greeks, and he goes into a lot of writing about that. The fourth important work of Tatian is referred to as the Diatessaron. write it up here in Greek and then transliterate it for you. Biatessaron. The diatessaron. The diatessaron. That we pronounce now in English the diatessaron. Literally, that means through four. It's what it literally means in Greek. Through four. Or we could say, we could add in the. Through the four. Wonder what the four has reference to. The Gospels. Through four. Through the four. It comes from a Greek musical term, which in Greek literally meant a harmony of four parts. Literally, it just says through four, but it's based on a Greek musical term that meant a harmony of four parts. And Tatian's diatessaron is the first so-called harmony of the Gospels. Now I'll conclude by sharing with you a few thoughts concerning books again. We'll pick up with the diatessaron again. We'll say a little more maybe about, or I think a little more about oration next time. How many of you have a harmony of the Gospels? It's indispensable. It's indispensable for serious study of the Gospels. It's indispensable to have in your possession a harmony of the Gospels. The diatessaron of Tatian is the earliest one known. Now, we think that some others existed by virtue of the fact of the colophon and the beginning of these two earlier Old Syriac manuscripts. We've already covered that before. But as far as proof is concerned, as far as having direct, definite, concrete evidence of it, this would be the earliest. It's been very, very popular in Christianity since that time, really before that time, up until present days, to try to get these four books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, who essentially are telling the same story, to get the material together, to harmonize it, to weave all of the material together so it reads like one narrative from the beginning of whatever, let's say the beginning of Luke, or really ought to go to the beginning of John, because it says in the beginning was the Word. So in the beginning of whichever gospel, all the way to whichever gospel contains the last act of Christ, such as ascension or what happens after the ascension, maybe Mark 16:20, if you're in favor of that. So it's been very, very popular, and many have been written. I have a whole collection of them at home, and I brought just a few of them along. Here's a little paperback. It was initially titled a handbook. That's how small it is. Baker's Harmony of the Gospels. If you can't afford very much, you can get this one for just a few dollars here. It's of the King James Version. It's a harmony of the Gospels. You've got two different types of harmonies. One that is what we would strictly call a harmony that weaves the whole story together in a narrative account here. So that you would just have, in other words, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, wherever they were alike, you would just have all the lines just read all together. For instance, if one gospel said, Jesus went to the lake and called his disciples, and another gospel said, Jesus went to the lake on the third day and called four disciples, saying to them, come and follow me, then you put all of that together, take out what's extra material, what's duplicated in both of them, so that you have one singular account there. That's extremely unreliable to do. Most of your better harmonies will not be done in that way. Tatian's diatessaron was done in that way. That way you're not comparing and contrasting, you're collating the material together, and you end up with collation on your hands as a result of that. And therefore you end up with part of the text that should be there that doesn't exist anymore. A better type of harmony is referred to as a synopsis. That's its technical name, although I only have one or so that's really referred to as a synopsis. And a synopsis will give things in columns like this. And Matthew discusses this incident, and Mark discusses it, and Luke discusses it, but John doesn't. So this is blank. And then Mark discusses this, and so does Luke, but Matthew doesn't. So this is blank. And then Matthew discusses this, and Luke does, and John does. So that when you read across this way, you have the same account on your hands then. Another one, A Harmony of the Gospels by Thomas and Gundry, that's based on the New American Standard, which is a good book, a good harmony, but it's based on NASB. Another one entitled The Words and Works of Jesus Christ. It's more than a harmony. It's a harmony. It's not a synopsis, but it's a commentary at the same time by J. Dwight Pentecost. The Words and Works of Jesus Christ, to study the life of Christ. Probably the standard for the last more than a century, standard harmony of the Gospels, is the broadest harmony that was redone decades ago by his pupil A.T. Robertson. It's referred to as Robertson's Harmony, a harmony of the Gospels. The standard broadest harmony, thoroughly revised, rearranged, and enlarged. Both of these were ancient professors of New Testament and Greek at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. That's the standard one. I still even have the sticker price on mine. $6.95 back in those days, which was November the 12th, 1977. So that's how long I've had this. Bought it at the Baptist bookstore. That's indispensable for serious studies of the Gospels. Indispensable. Has footnotes at the bottom and so forth. Something else that I would also say is indispensable simply because it gives you the Greek is this big thing, synopsis of the four Gospels. It gives you the Greek on the left-hand page and the English on the right-hand page. And an extremely reliable critical apparatus at the bottom of the page. See if I can find the page where we're dealing with similar material. Here's a good page. See all the vertical columns there? You should have the Greek over here and the English over here and a critical apparatus at the bottom. You've got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John across there. Same text as UBS and Nestle-Aland. Same Greek text in there, based on the same thing. Translation? If I remember correctly, RSV, I believe. And this is RSV. I think both of these are RSV, Revised Standard Version.